All right, well, welcome back. Welcome back. Hope your week's been going well. And as we continue our study here of Job, right, so we're looking through the story of Job, asking some very important questions. And we entitled this series, Meeting God in the Storm, because that's going to be very appropriate, right? Spoiler alert, the end of Job, God shows up in the storm, and there, hopefully, finally, we'll get some answers. But until then, right, we're gonna put a lot of questions forward and see how complicated we can make it. So what we've seen so far, Job's introduced in the story as this amazing man, like extraordinary, right? He's like beyond the rest of us, mere mortals. And he's just amazing, great faith. And he has a life that fits that, right? Because it kind of tunes in with this sense of justice, that a God that rewards those that follow him and punishes the wicked, which is a concept that, brings us comfort as we're all trying to follow God. And so he punishes the wicked and rewards the righteous. And Job has an amazing connection of both of those things. It's a very good cause and effect kind of approach, and fits with the perspective of Proverbs, which we looked at. But then there's events in the heavens, And so once again in the ancient world, the gods lived in the heavens. And then us here, mortals, and on the earth. And it doesn't just mean lump of rock. It means the physical reality. So there's God in the spiritual realm, and then us here in the physical realm. And we get a sneak peek, we get to look into the doings of the heavens. And so there the scene is set where it's God and his royal court. It's this ruling kind of example of a king and his royal court. And there it seems like they're going about the management of the world, of this reality. And so the sons of God, right, or angels as it's sometimes translated, and we looked into what that might mean. So they present themselves as in to give account, and then here comes Satan, right, or the accuser, whoever that figure is, and we looked at some possibilities. And then they have some kind of conversation, which is weird at best. So here's God and the Satan figure, and they're commenting upon reality here, and then a wager is struck, and then the faith of Job is going to be put to the test. And we saw how there's a back and forth. At least two different times we get to these events in the heavens. And we inevitably ask ourselves, as I think the narrator of the story is wanting the reader to contemplate, what's happening up there that we get the short end of the stick down here? I mean, have you ever just wondered that about government? What's going on there? How are these decisions being made? I mean, we get the talking points, right? We get the polished commentaries that have gone through 10 different agencies, and then it comes to us. It's like the final advertised product. It's not reality. It's just the fluffed stuff. But wouldn't it be amazing, perhaps scary, if we could just sneak in there one day where the real decisions are being made, where the real facts are being presented, and just sit there and just kind of maybe a fly on the wall and just what's really going through that mess? Well, we're not the only, this isn't a modern contemplation only. Humanity has been wondering that about all kinds of things, but inevitably about the world of the gods. Real or imagine, the heavens. What's happening up there that then has an impact here? And we get a sneak peek, and we're like, wow, this is going to be amazing. We're finally going to get insight, answers. And as we saw last time, it only complicated things. At least for me, it didn't really help a lot. and we're not even sure who that is, and some wage. Like, wait a minute. So it makes the reader, at least me, slightly uncomfortable of seeing kind of behind closed doors, if you will. Which I'm going to guess would also be true if we got a sneak peek into what government does and so forth. Well, so these two times there's events in the heavens, and we just kind of went back and forth on those. Now we're going to focus today on then down here, like on earth. So the gods, God and his royal court do things, decide things, and then what happens to Job. Right, so that's going to be our focus today. And then just a heads up, next time we're going to talk about Job chapter 3. If you've only taken the perspective of Job from the point being made of Job there in the New Testament, Job, a man of perseverance, like, oh yeah, he's just like a super pious, zealous guy and loved Jesus and stuck with it. True. But then let's read chapter 3, and it might make you more uncomfortable than you might already be, but that's for next time. Let's one set of uncomfortableness at a time. All right, so chapter 2, or chapter 1. So events happen in the heavens. God and Satan have some kind of conversation there. So a wager is struck. And then verse 12. So then the Lord said to Satan, very well then, everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger. So okay, some sense of boundaries, which is, if this is the devil, I think that's kind of comforting, and I don't know, right? God holds evil back. Yet once again, why is God and evil having a chat? If this isn't the devil, or Lucifer. Side note. You understand, none of those things are the names, is a name. They're all descriptors. It's like the writers of the storyline of the Bible did not want to dignify this creature thing with a name. So devil means prince of evil. Satan means the accuser. Lucifer is angel, morning star, which I think means kind of he can present himself that way. And Beelzebub means Lord of dung. Lord of dung. So then, I think that's also descriptive. So the Satan, so once again, we think the Satan, maybe, maybe not. But if this is then one of the royal courts that work for God, a prosecutor perhaps, God's still setting some boundaries, and I don't know. It's still like there's some punishment, but for what? So we'll get to that. But all right, so Satan leaves. Then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord, and every time God's talked about in the story of Job is either as Yahweh, which is Lord, or Almighty. I also don't think that's accidental. Who's in charge? But we'll get to that later. All right. Okay, what happens down here? Well, one more point. I think the story here wants us to understand that what happens in the heavens has an impact here. What happens in the heavens have it. Now, I'm still thinking through this, so bear with me. I'm still thinking through this. But I have more and more the understanding that what happens here mirrors what happens there, and what happens there is impacted by what happens here. At least in the story of Jesus, that's true. Right? So how those two worlds overlap, it's not always crystal clear, but I think they do. Right? I mean, Paul talks about our fight really isn't with government, the authorities of this world. It's the things behind it. John, in his vision, right, Revelation, the apocalypse, that's the point. That Rome is but a pawn a manifestation of evil. The vision that Daniel has in chapter 7 through 12, read that. If you're looking for some trippy stuff, read that. And there's like part of the vision, there's these, out of the waters come these 4 beasts. And not like any earthly beast, like it's a weird mixture. It's like a leopard with wings and then horns, and then there's a dragon that has 10 horns, and one horn is small but like mouthy. You know what I mean? Like normal, that player that's the smallest but talks trash. So there's that, and there's eyes on the horn, and they're devouring each other and trampling upon humanity. And then there's an explanation. Oh, those are the kingdoms that will come. And they're just trampling upon humanity. But the reason they are personified as these cosmic mystical beings is because evil's behind it. And then there's in the middle of all that, those visions that he has, it's Michael is trying. It says that Michael was coming to talk to Daniel, but he was caught basically fighting with the Prince of Persia. So if you ever want to have a cup of coffee, I like coffee. You want to have a cup of coffee and go down that rabbit hole, it's really weird. But all to say that whatever's happened up there seems to impact here, that whatever happens here seems to impact or mirror somehow up there. I think that point, I'm clear on that. To what degree it gets kind of strange. But it seems to be this is the case here for sure. So what happens down here? Verse 13. So one day, like just a day, probably a Monday, because I imagine that's also when Adam and Eve decided to try, from the fruit. Mondays are rough. So maybe a Monday. It says that Job's sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, and a messenger came to Job. So, hey, the kids are hanging out, and then it's like, pause that, and then here comes a messenger to Job, right? A messenger. And he said, the ox were plowing and the donkey were grazing nearby, and the Sabaeans attacked and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. Well, that's rough news. It's rough news. While he was still speaking, verse 16, another messenger came and said, the fire of God fell from the heavens and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I am the only one who escaped to tell you. Verse 17, while he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on the camels and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I alone escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, yet another messenger came and said, your sons and daughters, just stop right there. How's your day been going? How's the day been going? Right? Just like, it's all falling apart. It's all falling apart. And then, here, has somebody ever shared really bad news to you? Maybe even on a phone call? Did you sense it? Did you see it coming? Could you see it in their eyes? Could you hear it in their voice? He starts speaking, your sons and daughters. I mean, I don't know. I think Job just felt it. Your sons and your daughters were feasting and drinking at the oldest brother's house, when suddenly a mighty wind swept, and from the desert struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on all of them, and they're dead. And I alone escaped to tell you. Not to compare and minimize anybody's suffering, but I'd say this is a hard day. This is like it's all fallen apart. Like his entire life, his family, his money, his possessions, his world, it just all collapsed. And it's not like just the turn of the economy, the pandemic, 2008, the crash of the market, and then the oil bust, and, World War II. None of those things. I don't think you ought to be much of a religious person in that world. As you're hearing this and word spreads, as we'll see, word spreads, I wonder if people then would wonder if the gods are punishing Job. Because this is too much all too soon, all too intensely. This can't be random. This can't be occasional. This can't, you can't easily attribute it away. You know, if it hey, there's been some burglaries in the neighborhood, some folks been, cars been broken into, and so listen, Job, pay attention, and then two of the four messengers, two of the four tragedies, kind of like that. They're the Chaldeans, and then there's this gang and that one gang, and they just kind of did what gangs do. They came down, stole stuff, and that's tragic, killed a bunch of people, your servant, and okay. But all at once, that's already a little iffy. But then you have these two other moments where we have commentary. I don't think the Bible is saying that God brought fire from the heavens. I think this is the servant's commentary on it. Who controls the heavens, if not the spiritual beings, right? The word there is Elohim. Oh, my bad. One time God in the story here is not translated or is not called Yahweh or Lord or Almighty, because this word here in English is translated with a capital G. I think that's an assumption by the translator, because the word just literally means spiritual being, the word Elohim. So Elohim, what Elohim? I don't know, but an Elohim, a spiritual being, brought fire from the heavens, because that's who coordinates the world, the heavens, and burned up everything. Maybe Yahweh? I don't know, maybe. Maybe not. Because once again, the players in the story here don't have that whole conversation or that insight between Yahweh and Satan. So I think this is intentional. It's like the servant is making an assessment. And then the second one, the most tragic, like I said, I hate to compare suffering and pain, but his family, where all his kids, all 10, die at once, it's a wind. It's a wind. Well, once again, who's in charge of nature? Who's in charge of that? So I'm teaching, one of the classes I'm teaching at OC, this is a virtual class. It's Faith in the Problem of Suffering. One of the assignments is, there are two interesting assignments. One is by the time we get to Job and God at the end of the story, God shows up, Job's going to get a chance to say some things. I wanted the students to write a letter as if they are Job speaking to God. Not about the story themselves, but about that opportunity. So if you were able to speak to God and God would interact and answer you, what would you say? I got a lot of questions. I got some questions. Do you have some questions? A lot of them start with some generic, why is there suffering in the world? Why is something happen overseas? Why is this one tragedy, school shoot? But then inevitably it comes down to their own lives. Why did my grandma die? Why did I lose my job? Why did I just lose, this one lady in the class, she lost 5 family members to COVID in 3 weeks. This other was asking about, I think it's a cousin, the whole family was in a car, mom, dad, 2 siblings died, just this one girl survived. I got questions. I imagine you do too. What's happening to Job? Once again, you and I kind of we got an insight, but I don't know if that insight has helped. Now try to put yourself in Job's perspective. He has no insight. He's just been going about his business, going about his life, which up to now the narrator has said it's like beyond amazing. And it all collapses all at once. And so his response, verse 20, which is, it's astonishing, to be fair. At this, Job got up, tore his robe, shaved his head, then fell to the ground in worship. All right, a couple things there. The tore his robe, shaved his head, it was an ancient sign of mourning. It'd be like, today we don't even do that anymore, but not too long ago, people dressed in black, right, for kind of mourning. It was an outward expression of an inward pain. I don't know about the shaving the head thing, but I think it's helpful for the world to know that things aren't right with you. We go at great lengths to hide it and even try to act tough. How you doing? Oh, I'm great. Yeah, it's good. You're just twitching a little because you're about to cry. But no, it's good, and you just move on. And then if you truly are honest, people ask, hey, how's it going? And you just, people don't know what to do with that. They're like, okay, they really didn't want to know. They were just being polite. But here, how could you not know? And once again, shave your head. That's not the next day it's all back. It's a consistent mourning. I don't know how you lose 10 children and you're fine the next weekend, or the next year, or the next 5, or the next 10. And I think too often we're too dismissive, and we try too hard to pretend it's all better. And then society and our friends and our family want it to be better real quick because they don't want you being in pain, and they don't know how to deal with you being in pain. So they hope in a couple weekends it's better. And if you start crying every time, people show up to visit, or people stop visiting. So Job here is once again outwardly showing his pain, shave his head, and then he falls to the ground in worship. Okay, here's another thing I think we've done ourselves a disservice. We've, in our modern times here, we've associated the word worship with some songs we sing on Sunday. We even ask people, what's your congregation styles of worship? Oh, progressive, this, that, traditional. No. That's not some song you sing. That might be part of the praise, might be part of the worship. The concept of worship, listen carefully, this really makes the whole debate of what kind of worship should have, it's mute when you understand it this way. Worship means you, as a broken person in a broken world, you approach God as the solution to your pain and suffering. That's what worship is. You go to God. Oh, I go to God in a traditional way. I go to God in a progressive. What are you talking about? You come to God in a broken way. So he's not singing some song. He's coming to God dragging himself to God in desperation and grief, which is already profound. That where does he go to solve his pain and suffering, or for comfort? Maybe not even for solution. I don't know how you solve losing 10 children. For comfort, he goes to God. And what does he say to God? Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. Yeah, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that. I'm good with the God who gives, right? The Lord who blesses. I'm not sure with the concept of the Lord who takes. Is he taking children? How far do we take that comment? And once again, he doesn't use the generic word there, Elohim. He uses the word Yahweh. It's not some generic God or some spiritual being up there. It is God, Yahweh. It's the name of God, Lord God. He gives. We're good with that. He takes. And we praise him for being Lord. Yeah, I think that's pretty out of the ordinary. It's pretty out of the ordinary. So kudos for Job. Man of perseverance. In verse 22, in all this Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. Yeah, hold that thought. Hold that verse right there. Okay, second round, and then, if you remember, up in the heavens, God and Satan and all the sons of God show up, and they're having their thing, and then God's like, yay, look at Job, I knew it. Great man. He's like, and Satan's like, yeah, but you put a boundary on it. Like, you hedged him. I could mess with his world, but not him. And he says, you let me touch him, and he will curse you. I don't know what all the implications here, or all the reasoning here, but perhaps part of it is something like, it's extremely tragic to lose, loved ones, status, places, your position, your places, your world and your family. But is there something more tragic to have this chronic? I've never had a chronic illness. I have a headache and I'm already not having a good time. I don't do well with that. I really don't do well with being nauseated. I could tell you some examples. I won't, but I don't do well with it. I really, when I'm having that moment, like the stomach bug goes around like that, you know what I mean? That you're not yet throwing up. You're not better. You're transitioning. You know what I mean? It's like things are coming. In that moment, I would be super thrilled if Jesus returned. And occasionally you will hear me between, Jesus, So his point is that chronic, when there is no break in your pain, maybe physically, even with tragedy, right, with the loss of love, there's the occasional moment where you can still smile at something, enjoy, just walk in the sun, or, there's ways to comfort yourself occasionally. But he's like, when the person has no break from pain and suffering, they will that is the depths of desperation. I don't know, some people take their lives. I think because they get to such a dark, horrible place. And so, verse 6 of chapter 2, then the Lord said to Satan, very well, then he is in your hands, but spare his life. Which sounds like a good thing, but is it? When you're at that depths of despair, wouldn't just let's be done with it be a welcome thought? So, verse 7, Satan goes out of the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. Then Job took a piece of broken pottery and scraped himself with it as he sat among the ashes. Yeah, that's a disturbing imagery. You understand why the pottery? He's like popping the sores and pus, and he's like trying to get rid of the infection. I don't know how productive that is, but I think that's the goal. And now, of course, he's in horrible pain physically, emotionally, spiritually, because, what's happening. But I think there's a different layer here to it as well. So if you read Leviticus, and I've joked about this before, would Tim being a priest, if you imagine Tim as a priest, the book of Leviticus describes this category of being, quote unquote, unclean. And what that meant was there was 3 or 4 different things that would happen to you, right? And skin disease is one of them. Touching dead bodies or interacting with dead bodies. I think like blood and maybe like sexual discharges kind of things. So those things, they were symbols of the decay and mess and death of the world. And so when those things were happening to you, it's not like you were immoral. If you get a skin disease, it's not like you're immoral. It's you're just unclean. You're contaminated from this world. And so before you can approach the presence of God, the priest who is to be an intercessor was to look at your rash. Right? And then whatever you were to care for it. And then a week later, he looks at your rash again, and you can't come to God until then. So you're out here, sometimes literally out of the camp. And so then the priest would go out there on a house call. Can you imagine Tim checking your rash? Right? Please, somebody walk up to Tim and be like, Tim, I got a rash, so see how that goes. But so he goes out there to look at your rash, and if your rash is better, your skin disease, then you've been cleansed. Then you had to wash yourself symbolically and some stuff, and now you're cleansed and you can approach the presence of God. Yep, this isn't you just slightly unclean. You're like infested with the world of pain and suffering, I think is the imagery. Like, he would not be able to go to the temple. He could not go to God. Yet, so far, what was his first inclination? Is to go to God. Now, he's not just physically in pain. Is he now religiously, ceremonially unable to approach God? So is that like another layer of, whoa, maybe God doesn't even want you here? You see some things that are happening? And that wasn't just Israel. That was the ancient world. So in the 10 plagues, when Egypt has sores and stuff, that just wasn't just they have an itch. They also could not go to their gods. So it really put them in a hard place. Even their priests, who were supposed to be intercessors, can't go to the God to intercede on behalf of Egypt. So I think some of that's happening here. Because remember, he's not even an Israelite. He's from us. Like, he's a non-Israelite. So I think that would overlap with his situation as well. Plus, obviously, the horrible pain and suffering that he finds himself in physically. All right, so verse 9. Remember his wife? She's still here. She also lost everything. Also lost 10 kids. So, it's just a horrible experience for her as well. But his wife said to him, "Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die." It's interesting that her solution is what Satan proposed would happen. I think there's a lot of things happening here as well. If you go back to Genesis, God is creating Adam, humanity. And humanity as one is not an accurate reflection of this community of love that God is. So God creates 2, separate but intentionally connected. And the second, woman, Eve, is to be the Azer. We talked about in some sermons. She is to be the helper, helpmate, which in English doesn't do it justice. Other times that word is used is to describe God's relationship towards Israel. God is Israel's Azer. Does that seem like God's the quote-unquote the help? He's the toilet cleaner? No, it's like this necessary presence. You want to truly, completely be what God created you to be, you need God's presence. Humanity, to truly reflect a community of love that God is, we need to be 2. So Eve had a very important, necessary role to reflect the presence of God and thus a loving community as humanity was to be. However, So there's that ideal of what Eve was to be. However, there's another version of Eve in the story, and it's the deceived deceiver, where she then personifies the voice of folly. If you connect it with Proverbs, Proverbs personifies wisdom as a woman, calling out to the young people, come be in a relationship with me, but also personifies folly as a woman, calling out, come party. Let's get wild, come party with me. And then the reader of Proverbs is to choose what kind of relationship they want to have. What kind of Eve do you want to be in a relationship with? When you get to then Solomon is like the embodiment of finally humanity listening to the voice of God. But then there's also the voice of folly personified in his foreign wives. So I think this is the imagery again. I don't think this is like saying his wife was a fool. I think his wife is now playing the alternative perspective, the voice of folly, where maybe up to now she was playing the voice of reason. And so now she personifies that reoccurring voice of folly throughout the storyline. And she says the very thing that, Satan, be whoever that was, it said would happen. Because in her mind, whatever's happening to them is from the gods, or from God, from Yahweh. So she says, and it's interesting that she uses not Yahweh, but Elohim. Curse the spiritual being. Curse the spiritual being, which might make sense if they're not Jews. Maybe they're thinking just, I don't know, Yahweh, some spiritual being, the gods, the heavens. And here's his reply. You are talking like a foolish woman. Once again, I think hint to Proverbs. Hint to that version of Eve. You are speaking like a foolish woman. And here's why. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? Is God in the business of handing out trouble? Some of your versions, there's a version that says evil, which I guess gets even more complicated. All right, here's the interesting thing. The Hebrew there, God, shall we accept only good from God and not trouble? So the word good and the word trouble is the word tov and the word raw. Here's why that's significant. All the way back to Genesis chapter 1 and 2, there is those two words. And it's the tree of tov and ra, the tree of good and evil, or good and bad. And what does the tree represent in that story? It's you taking two approaches. There's the tree of life, and then there's the tree of tov and ra. So the tree of life represents God's presence as the source of life. It's like you continuously feed upon God. No, that gets weird. You feed upon the life of God. Or you take from the other tree that represents you defining for yourself life, goodness, bad, right, wrong. In other words, you go create your world. And humanity there is tested, tempted, and what choice do they make? A world where they will define right and wrong, where they will be God-like, where they will create their own existence. And we know the rest of the stories, it's just downhill. And so here it's like, he's having his Genesis 3 moment. He's having his Genesis 3 moment. Solomon had his Genesis 3 moment. In his prayer for wisdom, he says, but I am but a child. He wasn't physically a child, but like, I lack experience, God, and you have put me to rule over your great people. Give me the ability to discern between tov and ra. Help me make the Genesis 3 choice correctly. Adam and Eve failed. Solomon begins to make the right choices by listening to the presence of God. And then he starts to make his own choices. So it kind of slowly goes downhill. So he fails at the Genesis 3 moment. So here it's like Job is at that Genesis 3 moment again. To choose between Tov and Ra. And he's going to stick with God. Even though it gets messy. It gets messy. In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. Backtrack a second to the end of chapter 1. In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. That's kind of the same but different. And then here he says, in all this, Job did not sin in what he said. I think the narrator here is making a distinction. We're still good, like Job is still kind of on the right side of things. But Job, first he doesn't charge God with wrongdoing. He charges God with being in charge. And we know that's already kind of complicated. But he doesn't attest God to doing wrong. Here, he's like he doesn't sin, but he doesn't... Surely he's starting to think some things. Is he not? Wouldn't you? Like, what's happening? Nothing like you have the most amazing moment of faith, and the next thing your life gets worse. You know what I mean? That one moment, like you have that Genesis 3, like, should I cheat, not cheat at my work and stuff, and you stand up and do the right thing, and you get fired. And then your family is struggling, and you know what I mean? Like, am I being punished for doing right? And so he starts to wonder. And I know he's wondering because in Job 3, he's going to say what he's been wondering. And once again, it's not going to be fluffy, quite uncomfortable. So I was going to give all the answers now, but we're almost out of time. So next time, come back. I know I'm creating a lot of problems. Well, let me free myself from that guilt. I am highlighting a lot of problems the story of Job is creating, but that's by design of the story, and I think we need to honor that. Like he wants us to wrestle with these questions. I think too quickly we're like, yeah, trust God, it all gets better. You ever watch those religious movies? In like first half of the movie, everything is going bad. The football team isn't winning, the coach's life isn't going well. He has like his car breaks down, if I'm remembering the story right. Like his water heater busts, like it's all, wasn't there like a weird smell in the house? You know what I'm talking about? And then he has stays up all night, meeting Jesus, like journaling about like his new worldview. The next day, the smell disappears. His team wins that Friday night. His wife thinks he's like the hero that she remembers him being. And then he gets like a brand new truck, and then the world is happy. Yeah, I'm sorry, that's simplistic. And then we preach that. If we preach that, folks that are having a horrible time are like, what's up with this? I'm done with this. That's not for me. You guys are just fluffy. Or you're lying, or everybody else is a great, wonderful person, and my life is horrible. So we present a reality, we present a version of reality that is disconnected from reality. Yeah, not the story of Job. Can you relate to some of this? One of the classes I taught, we talked about when we get to the chapter 3, some of the stuff he says this. One of the students came up to me afterwards in tears and said, I didn't know feelings like that were in the Bible because I have those. You just read chapter 3 and you'll see what we're talking about. So let's finish introducing next class, right? Verse 11. When Job's three friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, Zophar the Nananite, heard about all these wonderful kids' names, I recommend them. None of these guys are Jews, right? So when they heard the troubles that came upon him, like it went viral, of course, they set out from their homes and met together by agreement to go and sympathize with him and comfort him. So these are good friends coming from a distance with good intentions. When they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads, and they sat with him on the ground for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him because there was nothing to be said. I went to visit one of my Bible teachers once. Some of you know Don Vincent. He was dying of cancer. When I walked in that hospital and I saw him, just seeing him, that was not him. And so they're just overwhelmed by looking at their friend. And so they're in silence because what else? What cliche can you just throw out there that's going to make it right? And so they say nothing except lamenting with him in his sorrow and silence. And that brings us to chapter 3, which will be next week. Come back. Let's close with a prayer. Dear God, we're thankful for the opportunity to venture into this story, this sticky and messy story of humanity and their interaction with you and your rule and your interaction with humanity. Give us clarity as we walk through this. Allow us to do as justice, that you can open our minds and open our hearts, and that we can learn from the story of Job. Thank you for being almighty and from being Lord of all. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.